I interviewed the director Pete Docter about this a few months ago, and he said that his original pitch to John Lasseter, who's the guy at the very top of Disney and Pixar, and personally okays all of the films and projects that are on the go there, his opening lines of the pitch was that it's a film about an 11-year-old girl, but she's not the main character, she's the setting. And that kind of sums it up perfectly. And, in that sentence is an incredible amount of ingenuity here. I talked earlier about how this is the film that is kind of it's a slight comeback for Pixar, because we've had a Pixar film-free year of 2014, and then before then the three films, Cars 2, Monsters University and Brave, were kind of not the studio really firing on all cylinders or producing the crazily innovative work of that early golden period. I think Inside Out is not only a return to form, I think it actually surpasses their previous form. I think there's a visual and a narrative sophistication to this film that Pixar, the earlier version of Pixar, probably wouldn't have been able to cope with. It's something that you can, the kind of story that's so complex and so clever that you can only tell it with this kind of clarity of purpose and this kind of crispness of vision, with all that previous work under your belt. The film actually reminded me of most was not a previous, although it's got a lot of similarities to Monsters, Inc., Pete Docter's original film at Pixar. It's kind of got that buzzy, modernist fantasy world in which it's set, which is a way that you can explain human behaviour by kind of characterising it by this world. But more so than that, it reminded me a lot of Spirited Away, a film by Hayao Miyazaki, who works for Studio Ghibli. Both movies, weirdly, are triggered by an 11-year-old girl moving house. Spirited Away opens on Chihiro in the back of her parents' car, very sullenly being driven to her new place where she's going to live. Inside Out opens, it doesn't open quite with that. It opens spectacularly, which we'll talk about in a second. But the opening credits are this journey from a childhood home to the place in which she's going to be doing her growing up. And like Spirited Away, it uses this kind of fantasy landscape as a way of exploring the roiling emotions that are on the inside of this little girl's head that she can't necessarily express in a forthright way. And the complexity of the interplay between the world inside Riley's head and the real world, when you're watching the film, seems totally smooth and totally intuitive. I don't think it's not giving anything away to say that early in the film, joy and sadness become exiled from Riley's head, and they end up in the far reaches of her long-term memory. And they have to make their way back to headquarters.
Through the train of thought.
Through the train of thought, through the kind of chasms of her subconscious, through her dream factory, all these kind of incredibly wonderful things. Now, the things that happen to them along the way all have real-world analogues. So what they do inside Riley's headspace affects the way in which Riley behaves. And at the same time, with joy and sadness out of the picture, fear, anger and disgust are left at the controls. So when Riley's at the dinner table having her supper, and her mum says, "How was school today?" Anger is sitting there thinking, okay, so I need to respond in the style of joy, which was like, fine, thanks. But because it's anger doing it, she says, fine, thanks. And that's sarcasm, but the way in which that's articulated and the way in which she's come to that to behave in that way, just when you're watching, it's totally intuitive. But the sheer amount of effort that must be involved in setting up these parallels between the two worlds is quite phenomenal.
But it's also that thing, it's important to say, isn't it, that, there's a great big sophisticated idea here. There's Pete Docter's definitely sort of been through some sort of child psychoanalysis inside the script, and he goes into those areas of child psychology and on our own. But it's not a dry film, is it? It's a very fun ride, isn't it? I mean, children, as I say in that interview, I went with my 11-year-old son, and we both equally enjoyed it. It's working on lots of different levels, isn't it?
It's totally the differentiation between the real world and the internal mental world is very visually cleverly done. The real world, I'm going to use words like shot and camera here. Of course, there's no shot, there's no real camera, it's animation. But the way in which they built those scenes in the real world, the camera has a little bit of a bob and a kind of a lag to it, and a kind of a human touch. Things come towards the foreground of the frame very quickly, and you'll see the camera kind of rack focus and just try and keep it in focus. Now, those are visual cues that you get when you're watching a kind of a low-budget indie movie that has been, perhaps shot handheld and does not have an expert focus pool working on it. And Pixar have built those visual cues into an animation where they needn't be in order to evoke that kind of emotional rawness that you get from that in the real world. In the mental world, at the same time is totally different. It's staged like a big kind of a old school Hollywood musical. The camera movements are incredibly precisely choreographed. They sweep around and soar around. The sets have shiny floors. It feels very much like a studio production, which again evokes a different way of feeling.
Well, it also looks like the Starship Enterprise.
It does. No, it's totally artificial, but it has that kind of not overwrought sense of emotion, but the very kind of vivid technicolor emotions that you have from watching those kind of films. So it's all encoded into the visual language of the movie. And, look out for these things when you go and see the film, the tiny, tiny little touches. This is not some kind of a hippy-dippy, chirpy-wirpy splurge about feelings and how wonderful feelings are. It's meticulously put together and describes these things with total clarity. And I think for children watching it, to be able to then, like Amy was saying, to articulate how they're feeling in terms of these 5 characters in their head, it's a new way to think about, how human consciousness works. For parents as well, this realization that, the way of thinking that we have in childhood totally transforms as we grow older, and it has to transform. And getting rid of those old ways of thinking is a very sad thing, but it's a very necessary thing too. I don't know, you've seen the film Under the Skin.
Yes.
With Scarlett Johansson as this alien who comes to Earth to eat unsuspecting people.
Jonathan Glenn.
Now, not immediately a film that has a mountain of stuff in common with Inside Out, but you come out of Under the Skin, and I find myself certainly looking at people on the street and thinking, who are these totally kind of inscrutable bags of meat? I have no way of relating to these people. I can't understand their thoughts. Inside Out is the reverse of that. You come out kind of with this reinvigorated respect and love of the human condition and the way in which people's emotions kind of set them up to do things.
When the Culture Show first started, I did a report about the rise of computer graphic animation, in which we had hand-drawn animators worrying that actually their art form was going to be lost, but quite the opposite has happened.
I'm sorry, this was the point at which I started going, then comrades come rally. Sorry, okay. As for the rest of them,
What was that?
That's the Internationale.